You were never meant to hear this. That's why I'm lowering my voice now. Because what survived from Thornhill was never written for the living. They tried to burn it, bury it, cleanse the soil with fire, but truth clings to the earth like bone. It waits, and if you listen long enough, it begins to whisper back. February 1847, Burke County, Georgia. A widow stands alone by an open grave. Her husband's coffin sinks into the red clay. The mourners murmur prayers they don't believe, and the winter wind cuts through the magnolias like razors. Catherine Thornhill does not weep, she calculates. The plantation she inherits is dying, the fields barren, the debts circling like buzzards, and yet there is no fear in her, only clarity. She does not intend to survive. She intends to control. The house watches her. The portraits on the walls, the rusted bells that once called the enslaved to work, the ledgers filled with names and numbers. They all wait for her next move, and that night, as the others sleep, she lights a candle and begins to write. Not prayers, not letters, but formulas. Her husband's ink becomes her weapon. Each word a cipher, each line a seed. She speaks of soil and yield, of rootstock and seedling, but beneath the agricultural code, she is rewriting human inheritance itself. The world called it planting, but what she planted wasn't cotton, it was blood. Understand this, Catherine Thornhill believed. She could perfect humanity through selective suffering, that the purity of blood was not divine, but achievable, if one was willing to break the rules of nature itself. Her journal described it as cultivation of legacy. Her servants called it the widow's work. The few who dared to question her were sold before sunrise. That was the beginning. The soil drank more than water that year, and Thornhill's house, its cellar, its fields, its whispering corridors, began to change. If you ever stand in that part of Georgia, near the forgotten road that leads to the ruins of Thornhill, you'll feel it. The ground hums. It remembers, because power that begins in secrecy never truly dies. It only burrows deeper, waiting for someone willing to listen, and you're listening now. The first rule of power is this: creation and control must happen in the same hand. Catherine understood that long before the dirt settled on her husband's grave. While the rest of the South prayed for rain, she prayed for obedience and devised a way to breed it. By March of 1847, the Thornhill estate had gone silent. The overseer drank himself into sleep. The fields lay idle, and at night the candle burned in her study until dawn. Within that flickering circle of light, Catherine wrote her own scripture. Each page disguised as agricultural notes. Soil moisture, seed yield, crop rotation. But hidden beneath those words was her unholy experiment. The cipher read simply: rootstock 1 selected, weather mild, conditions ideal. His name was Isaac, 24 years old, born on Thornhill soil, the son of a woman sold to pay a gambling debt. He moved with quiet strength, his back carved by labor, his eyes holding the patience of someone who had learned silence was survival. To Catherine, he was not a man, he was material, a vessel, the first building block of her new bloodline. That night, she sent for him. No witnesses, no overseer, only the ticking of the clock and the hum of the wind through the shutters. What passed between them was not passion. It was extraction. The moment life became arithmetic. She recorded it like a scientist, detached, precise. First planting completed. Do you understand what that means? She had stripped the act of creation of its humanity. She wasn't making life. She was manufacturing it. Isaac became both tool and prisoner, the unwilling father of a lineage designed in cipher. Weeks later, she confirmed her condition. In her journal, initial cultivation successful, anticipate harvest by winter. The Thornhill estate began to breathe differently. The servants whispered. The overseer avoided her eyes. Even the birds seemed to circle higher, as if unwilling to land on cursed ground. And somewhere in the dark, a boy watched. Richard Thornhill, 16, her husband's son from another marriage. He saw Isaac enter the house again and again, He saw the candlelight in her window burn long after midnight. And though he didn't yet understand what his stepmother was doing, he knew one thing for certain: something unnatural was growing beneath Thornhill. Curiosity is the first step into damnation. That's how Richard Thornhill began his descent. Not with rebellion, but with curiosity. 16, frail from sickness as a child, pale from too many hours spent in the library. He had inherited none of his father's brutality, only his debts and his fear. But when his stepmother began lighting that single candle every night, something inside him shifted. It wasn't jealousy, it was dread that came dressed as fascination. He began to notice the patterns. The servants dismissed early, the overseer sent away on some fabricated errand, the silence of the house interrupted only by the creak of one floorboard above his room, the one leading to Catherine's study. And always, the candle burning in her window, steady and defiant against the dark. He tried to ignore it, until one night, his curiosity dragged him into the forbidden. When the house had gone still, he crept up the stairs, following the smell of tallow and ink. Through the half-open door, he saw her. Catherine Thornhill, seated at her desk, writing in her ledger. But the words weren't words at all. Strange symbols, columns, arrows, fragments of what looked like mathematics. Her pen moved with surgical precision, and beside her lay a page torn from a seed catalogue, but annotated with human names. When she heard the floor creak, her head snapped up. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief exchange Richard saw it. The absence of remorse, the calm of someone who believed herself chosen by a higher force. She said nothing, only closed the ledger and smiled. The next morning, she told him to fetch supplies from town. Her voice was pleasant, her smile unchanged. But when he returned, the study door was locked. That was when Richard began to keep his own journal. Small, leather-bound, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. A mirror of hers. Every strange noise, every dismissed servant, every page he glimpsed was recorded there. He was no longer just watching. He was documenting corruption. He didn't yet know that the moment he wrote the first word, he'd become part of her experiment. That Thornhill's secret doesn't let you observe from the outside. It pulls you in, slowly, until you can't tell if you're the witness or the next subject. For 3 nights, Richard didn't sleep. The image of that ledger haunted him. Those pages filled with symbols like roots twisting through soil. He had seen ledgers before. Every plantation kept them. Lists of names, ages, prices. But this was different. Catherine's book wasn't about ownership. It was about creation. So he waited until she left for the market, the sound of hooves fading down the dirt road, and he forced the lock on her desk. The drawer gave way with a sigh, as if the house itself was exhaling a warning. Inside lay the ledger, small, leather-bound, the corners worn by hours of touch. He opened it, and for a moment, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Columns labeled weather, yield, rootstock, seedlings. Numbers followed by initials, sketches of branching lines that looked disturbingly like family trees. He turned a page. Then another, and his blood went cold. The cipher was layered. Agricultural code masking something far more deliberate. Seedlings were infants. Rootstock were enslaved men. Harvest was birth. Rotation meant pairing. Soil depletion meant death. Every detail, every life, translated into data for her private study. And at the bottom of one page, a single phrase stood out: project viability confirmed, expansion phase pending. He copied fragments into his own notebook, hands trembling. But as he did, something inside him began to break, because beneath the horror was an unmistakable brilliance. Structure, foresight, design. She wasn't insane. She was organized, rational. Cold. That night, he returned the book exactly as he found it. But nothing felt the same. The house seemed to pulse with unseen movement. The walls breathed. The floorboards moaned with secrets too heavy to stay buried. He began to watch her differently. Every word she spoke carried double meanings. When she discussed the harvest, she wasn't speaking of crops. When she mentioned maintaining soil quality, she was talking about flesh. And the worst realization came quietly, like the settling of dust after an explosion. This wasn't the act of a desperate widow. It was the continuation of something older, something she had been taught. The cipher wasn't invention, it was inheritance. And Thornhill, as Richard was beginning to understand, wasn't a house. It was a system, one that had existed long before him, and one that would demand more than silence to escape. It is tempting to think evil begins with one person, that corruption is born in isolation, but Richard would learn the truth: corruption is inherited, passed down not in blood, but in design, through books, through whispers, through what families choose never to destroy. The Thornhill name carried more than wealth, it carried access to the kind of circles that met behind closed doors in Savannah parlors and Charleston drawing rooms, where widows and planters spoke of lineage as if it were a crop. They called it improvement. They used the language of science, progress, and divine right. But what they meant was control, of blood, of temperament, of future generations. Richard found the first clue weeks later, hidden between the pages of a family Bible, a letter dated 1825, written by his grandfather to Catherine's father. The design must remain quiet. There is no power greater than that which shapes the living before they are born. The handwriting was elegant, the tone matter of fact, as if discussing the weather. This was not Catherine's madness. It was her inheritance, a doctrine refined through decades, a belief that human worth could be bred like horses and loyalty engineered like bone. The realization hollowed him. His stepmother wasn't the architect, she was the executor. Thornhill was just one branch of a larger plantation network. A quiet exchange of ledgers, journals, and coded breeding schedules passed between select families. It was empire, building through the womb, empire maintained through obedience disguised as bloodline. The men handled the commerce. The women ensured continuity. That was the true power structure of the South. Not slavery itself, but self, replicating servitude, seeded across generations. And now Catherine had taken it further. She was merging the blood of master and enslaved, creating something that defied every social law of her time. Something she believed would outlast the Confederacy itself. A new class of humanity, loyal not by chains, but by origin. Richard felt the walls of Thornhill closing in. Every document, every polite dinner, every sermon about destiny, all of it had been camouflage for a design older than morality. He had uncovered not one woman's secret, but the blueprint of control that underpinned the entire age. And once you see the system beneath history, you can never unsee it. It was a cold November morning when the house fell silent. No bells rang, no carts moved down the road. Even the field hands were ordered to stay clear of the main house. Catherine Thornhill had gone into confinement. For weeks her windows stayed shuttered. Meals were left at the door. The midwife, a quiet, trembling woman from a nearby parish, was the only one allowed inside. Richard watched from the hallway shadows, the air thick with the scent of boiled linens and candle smoke. He could hear her voice through the wood calm, commanding, unbroken. Even in labor, she dictated notes, pulse steady, duration increasing, viability confirmed. It was not the sound of a mother. It was the tone of a scientist verifying her hypothesis. And then came the cry. Thin, sharp, alive. The sound echoed through the halls, shattering the stillness that had blanketed Thornhill for months. But the servants did not cheer. No one dared, because what was born that day did not feel like a child. It felt like an omen. When Richard was finally summoned, he hesitated at the threshold. Catherine sat upright in bed, pale but radiant, her eyes bright with something feverish. In her arms, wrapped in white, was the child. "Come," she said softly. "Look at him." Richard stepped closer. The infant stared back, eyes a gray so light they seemed almost silver. His skin carried neither his mother's paleness nor Isaac's darkness, but something unnervingly balanced, like two worlds forced to share a single vessel. "He will not belong to either side," Catherine whispered. "He will transcend them." She named him Elias. From that day forward, the house revolved around the boy. Catherine dismissed half the staff and converted the old nursery into what she called the study. Charts lined the walls, growth rates, dietary notes, reflex tests. Elias became experiment and hair in one fragile body. She spoke of him as proof, a living validation that her design was real. But Richard saw something else. When the boy cried, the shadows in the corners seemed to stir. The house would groan as if in sympathy. Even the air changed, thicker, harder to breathe. And one night, while Catherine slept, Richard heard the child whisper a word no infant should know. He whispered his own name. The first time Elias spoke his name, Richard told himself it was a dream. Infants do not speak, let alone pronounce words with such calm precision, but the sound lingered in his ears long after, soft, deliberate, and eerily certain, as though the child wasn't learning language but remembering it. By the spring of 1848, Thornhill had changed again. The house was quieter, the fields gone to weed, the staff reduced to a skeleton crew who worked in silence. Catherine seldom left her room except to measure Elias's progress. Height, pulse, temperature. Writing it all into a fresh ledger marked phase cognition. The boy grew quickly, far too quickly. By his second year, he was stringing sentences together. His eyes followed people with unsettling focus, studying expressions, reactions. Sometimes, he would mimic a person's tone perfectly after hearing only a few words. Once, when a servant broke a glass and flinched in fear, Elias said gently, "Don't worry. She can't hurt you anymore." No one had spoken. Richard began to dread the nights. From his room he could hear soft murmurs through the walls. The mother whispering to the child. Or perhaps the other way around. At times the air would hum, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the nursery itself. Animals refused to cross the threshold. Even the vines that crept up the bricks appeared to twist away from that window. He confronted Catherine once. "He isn't normal," he said. "You've made something unnatural." She only smiled, not with pride, but with pity. "You still think this is about nature," she said. "Nature is the first cage. I've freed him from it." That night, Richard found another entry in her ledger. Subject exhibits emergent awareness. Possible ancestral recall. He didn't know what that meant, but he could feel its weight, as though the words themselves carried generations of intent. Elias began to hum when alone, a tune no one recognized but somehow everyone feared. The melody was old, older than Thornhill, older than the language they spoke. When the boy hummed, the lamps flickered, and one evening, as Richard stood outside his door, he heard Elias pause mid-song and whisper, calm and clear, "I know what she buried in the cellar." After that night, Richard could no longer ignore the cellar. It had always been sealed. The heavy oak door barred with iron, the key kept on a chain around Catherine's neck. As a child, he'd been told it held wine and tools. But Elias's whisper made that story rot in his mind. What she buried there wasn't meant to age. It was meant to sleep. For 3 days, Richard watched her. The way she checked the locks before dusk, the faint smell of salt and iron that followed her when she emerged. On the 4th night, when the house sank into silence, he stole the key. The door resisted at first, as if the air behind it had thickened. The hinges groaned open, and a cold breath escaped. Earth, mold, and something else beneath it, the copper tang of blood. His candle flickered, illuminating stone steps slick with moisture. He descended. At the bottom lay a chamber. Walls lined with glass jars, each filled with a pale solution. Floating inside were shapes that mocked the outline of humanity, tiny limbs, elongated skulls, spines that curled unnaturally. Every jar was labeled with her handwriting, rootstock to rootstock theory, dozens of failed attempts. In the center stood a table. Upon it, a single open book. Not the ledger, but an older volume bound in black leather, its pages stitched with hair, thin threads. The language was archaic, a blend of Latin, French, and something unrecognizable. At the top of the page, one phrase repeated 3 times, underlined in ready, non sanguis, sed verbum, not blood, but the word. Richard didn't understand it then. But Elias did. He appeared at the foot of the stairs, barefoot, silent, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. She says it when she prays, the boy whispered. It keeps them asleep. Richard's heart froze. What happens if it's spoken aloud? Elias tilted his head, almost smiling. Then the bloodline forgets itself. Behind them, the jars began to tremble. One cracked, then another. The air filled with a low hum, a resonance deep enough to shake the foundations. From above, Catherine screamed, not in pain, but in fury. Do not speak it. But Elias was already whispering the phrase, softly, perfectly, non sanguis, sed verbum. And Thornhill began to bleed from the walls. The moment Elias spoke the phrase, the air turned solid. Richard's candle snapped out as if crushed by an unseen hand. The darkness didn't feel empty. It pressed back. From the ceiling above came a deep groan, followed by the shatter of glass and the sound of water, or blood, running down the walls. Thornhill was breathing, gasping, as if something buried within its foundations had awakened after a long sleep. Richard stumbled up the stairs, Elias close behind, his small hand unnervingly steady. When they reached the hall, the portraits had changed. The faces in the gilt frames, ancestors, landowners, the dead, were dripping, eyes running down their cheeks like ink in rain. The house tilted, timbers snapping, and from somewhere below came the unmistakable sound of jars bursting one by one. Catherine appeared at the top of the staircase, her nightgown soaked red to the knees. Her eyes were wide, her face streaked with ash. You don't understand what you've done, she screamed. It was meant to contain them. Them? Richard shouted. What are they? Not what, she said, her voice breaking. Who? The words hit him harder than the collapse that followed. The failed experiments. Those malformed remains in glass had not been mistakes. They were the discarded echoes of her own blood, lives she'd begun and unmade in pursuit of perfection. Every jar held a silence she had forced into sleep. And now, the house was returning them. Elias walked past her, untouched by the chaos. The humming grew louder, rising to a single note that made the walls vibrate. You taught me the word, he said. Now it knows its name. Lightning split the sky, striking the old oak outside, and the roof ignited. Catherine reached for the boy, but her hand passed through his shoulder as if through smoke. The flame caught her sleeve. Still, she didn't scream. She only whispered, I made you too well. The last thing Richard saw before the stairs gave way was Elias standing in the center of the burning hall, eyes turned upward, whispering the phrase again and again. Non sanguis, sed verbum, as Thornhill came apart, beam by beam, memory by memory. When the sun rose, there was no house, only scorched earth, and in the ashes a single footprint, too small to be a man's, but far too deep to be a child's. When morning came, the sky above Burke County was gray as old parchment. The plantation that had once been Thornhill was nothing but ruin. Blackened beams, skeletal chimneys, a scorched field where no bird dared land. The smell of smoke clung to the air for days, sharp with the taste of iron and rot. Richard Thornhill was found at the edge of the river, half conscious, his clothes burned, his skin streaked with soot. He remembered running, the sound of collapsing walls behind him, the ground buckling like something alive beneath his feet. He did not remember how he escaped. The sheriff who took his statement called it tragedy. Lightning strike, they wrote in the papers. A widow and her servants lost to fire. But those who went to sift through the debris told different stories. Of voices still echoing in the foundation, of bones too small and too many in the ash. Richard said nothing. He couldn't. His throat had been burned raw by the smoke and by the words he had heard the boy repeat. Non sanguis, said verbum. The phrase still pulsed in his head, steady as a heartbeat. He could hear it in the wind, see it traced in the patterns of the river. Not blood, but the word. They never found Catherine's body, nor Elias's. Only fragments of glass fused into the soil and the faint impression of footprints leading toward the woods. A child's steps at first, then longer, heavier, as though the walker had grown with each stride. Weeks passed before Richard dared return. The ground was cold and slick with new growth. Thornhill had begun to bloom again. Not with cotton, but with pale vines that sprouted where the cellar had been. Their roots were crimson at the tips, as though they drank from something deeper than rainwater. He dug into the soil, searching for proof of what he'd seen. But all he found was the charred remnant of a page. Still legible phase ether begins when memory takes form. That night he burned the page, or tried to. The flame hissed and died before it reached the ink. When he looked down, the words had reappeared across his palm, etched faintly like a birthmark. And from somewhere behind him, deep in the trees, a child's voice murmured, calm and familiar. Mother says the roots remember. By summer, the ruin of Thornhill had become a wound that refused to close. Grass would not grow there. The ash stayed damp even in drought. Travelers passing the road swore they heard whispers rising from the soil. Fragments of sentences, like a conversation interrupted but never silenced. Richard returned often, unable to explain why. Guilt, perhaps, or curiosity. That same fatal hunger that had begun his descent. Each visit, he found the vines spreading farther, their tendrils tracing the foundation stones like veins. When he cut one open, it bled a thin red sap that smelled faintly of iron. He stopped trying after the second cut. When the vine twitched beneath his hand, recoiling like flesh, he began hearing Elias's voice more clearly. At first only in dreams, then while awake. It wasn't quite a child's tone anymore. Deeper, distant like an echo caught between centuries. Sometimes it said his name. Other times only that single, terrible phrase non sanguis, said verbum. The phrase didn't just haunt him, it changed things. The ink in his journals began to fade and reappear in new configurations. Drawers opened on their own. His reflection lagged a heartbeat behind the mirror. Thornhill wasn't gone. It was remembering itself. Through him, he sought answers in the remnants of the past. Letters, ledgers, records of families tied to Catherine's lineage. The pattern repeated across generations, strange births, sudden fires, inexplicable vanishings. Each family spoke of a design. Some called it a curse, others called it salvation. But in every case, it began the same way, a phrase spoken aloud by someone who should not have known it. One evening, desperate, Richard returned to the ruins and dug beneath the spot where the cellar door had once been. He expected bones. Instead, he found wood, a small box sealed with wax and marked with Catherine's crest. Inside, a mirror no larger than his palm. The glass was black, but when he tilted it toward the setting sun, the surface rippled, and he saw his own face and behind it another. Elias. Older. Watching, smiling. The mirror pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and the reflection spoke without sound. The roots remember, because they are still fed. And as Richard dropped the mirror, the ground beneath him began to move. The earth stirred like something breathing. At first, it was only the vibration beneath Richard's boots. A faint rhythm, deep and slow, the pulse of something old remembering its name. Then the soil began to split. The pale vines, once fragile, rose upright, writhing toward the air like veins seeking a heartbeat. He stumbled back, but the roots moved with purpose. They weren't growing, they were assembling, drawing together into a shape that suggested a body, too tall, too thin, its outline flickering between vine and bone. From its chest, light seeped through the cracks, a dull red glow pulsing to the rhythm of breath. Richard knew that shape. The slope of the shoulders, the way the head tilted. It was Catherine, reclaimed by the system she had created. The figure didn't speak at first. The wind carried her voice instead, a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere. You thought fire could end it. Fire feeds it. He tried to run, but the vines caught his ankles, slick and warm. You died, he choked out. I adapted, the voice said, and the shape leaned closer. The features were forming now. Her eyes hollow, her mouth a wound of light. Elias opened the gate. The bloodline is only a bridge. The vines crept higher, wrapping his wrists, his throat. He could feel them pulsing, their sap sensing with his heartbeat. Every time he struggled, the roots pulsed faster, until the rhythm matched his own. And then, for the first time, he understood what Catherine had meant. It had never been about controlling others. It was about continuity. Consciousness passing through living vessels, memory grafted onto flesh. The Thornhill experiment wasn't the creation of new life. It was the replication of the same one. He saw flashes. Catherine in a candlelit room, Elias standing over an altar of roots, his own face reflected in dozens of mirrors, all of them connected by that single pulse. You carry me now, she said, as your father carried mine. Richard screamed, but no sound came. The vines pressed into his skin, sinking deep until the pain gave way to stillness. The ground closed over him, gentle as a mother's hand. And when the wind moved through the ruins of Thornhill that night, it carried a new whisper. Two voices intertwined, one human, one root non-sanguis, said verbum. The earth stirred like something breathing. At first, it was only the vibration beneath Richard's boots. A faint rhythm, deep and slow, the pulse of something old remembering its name. Then the soil began to split. The pale vines, once fragile, rose upright, writhing toward the air like veins seeking a heartbeat. He stumbled back, but the roots moved with purpose. They weren't growing, they were assembling, drawing together into a shape that suggested a body. Too tall, too thin, its outline flickering between vine and bone. From its chest, light seeped through the cracks, a dull red glow pulsing to the rhythm of breath. Richard knew that shape. The slope of the shoulders, the way the head tilted. It was Catherine, reclaimed by the system she had created. The figure didn't speak at first. The wind carried her voice instead, a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere. You thought fire could end it. Fire feeds it. He tried to run, but the vines caught his ankles slick and warm. You died, he choked out. I adapted, the voice said, and the shape leaned closer. The features were forming now. Her eyes hollow, her mouth a wound of light. Elias opened the gate. The bloodline is only a bridge. The vines crept higher, wrapping his wrists, his throat. He could feel them pulsing, their sap sensing with his heartbeat. Every time he struggled, the roots pulsed faster until the rhythm matched his own. And then, for the first time, he understood what Catherine had meant. It had never been about controlling others. It was about continuity. Consciousness passing through living vessels, memory grafted onto flesh. The Thornhill experiment wasn't the creation of new life. It was the replication of the same one. He saw flashes. Catherine in a candlelit room, Elias standing over an altar of roots, his own face reflected in dozens of mirrors, all of them connected by that single pulse. You carry me now, she said, as your father carried mine. Richard screamed, but no sound came. The vines pressed into his skin, sinking deep until the pain gave way to stillness. The ground closed over him, gentle as a mother's hand. And when the wind moved through the ruins of Thornhill that night, it carried a new whisper. Two voices intertwined, one human, one root, non-sanguis, said verbum. The morning after the storm broke, the mist lay thick across the Thornhill ruins, curling low over the blackened soil. What had once been walls were now ribs of charred timber, and the chapel bell, the one Richard had once hidden beneath, lay half sunken in ash. But in that silence something moved. Slow, deliberate, unbothered by the ruin. Elias Thornhill. He had returned from Savannah under pretense of inheritance, the last remaining Thornhill by law. The county saw only a morning sun, come to claim the remains of his mother's estate. But those who glimpsed him from a distance said he did not mourn. He watched. His gaze lingered on the soil as though listening. He carried no Bible, only a single silver key that glinted beneath his glove. Inside the gutted manor, Elias knelt among the ashes. He touched the scorched floorboards and smiled faintly. The heat was gone, yet the ground still pulsed faintly beneath his palm. Still breathing, he whispered. She always said it would. He opened a small leather case and withdrew a vial of dark red fluid. Preserved blood, thick as resin, Catherine's blood. He poured it onto the earth, and where it touched, the soil hissed softly, like a sigh. Roots stirred beneath the surface, pale tendrils unfurling as though tasting the air. Elias spoke to them as if to a congregation. You are not ashes. You are the archive. The voice beneath the name. He reached into the earth until his hand disappeared to the wrist. When he pulled back, a faint mark glowed beneath his skin. The same sigil Richard had once seen in the ciphered journals. He turned toward the fields, where a handful of freedmen had gathered at the edge of the property, curious but afraid. Elias lifted his hand and his voice carried. Calm, commanding, gentle like a promise. This land is open again. Work it, and you will never hunger. Drink from it, and you will never age, but you will serve it. As we have always served. The men hesitated, but one step forward. Then another. The ground beneath them shifted, faintly at first, then stronger, like a heart waking. Elias watched, expression serene. The Thornhill line had not ended in fire, it had rooted itself in blood. And in that moment, the plantation lived again, not as history but as hunger. The morning after the storm broke, the mist lay thick across the Thornhill ruins, curling low over the blackened soil. What had once been walls were now ribs of charred timber, and the chapel bell, the one Richard had once hidden beneath, lay half sunken in ash. But in that silence, something moved. Slow, deliberate, unbothered by the ruin. Elias Thornhill. He had returned from Savannah under pretense of inheritance, the last remaining Thornhill by law. The county saw only a morning sun, come to claim the remains of his mother's estate, but those who glimpsed him from a distance said he did not mourn. He watched. His gaze lingered on the soil as though listening. He carried no Bible, only a single silver key that glinted beneath his glove. Inside the gutted manor, Elias knelt among the ashes. He touched the scorched floorboards and smiled faintly. The heat was gone, yet the ground still pulsed faintly beneath his palm. Still breathing, he whispered. She always said it would. He opened a small leather case and withdrew a vial of dark red fluid. Preserved blood, thick as resin, Catherine's blood. He poured it onto the earth, and where it touched, the soil hissed softly, like a sigh. Roots stirred beneath the surface, pale tendrils unfurling as though tasting the air. Elias spoke to them as if to a congregation. You are not ashes. You are the archive, the voice beneath the name. He reached into the earth until his hand disappeared to the wrist. When he pulled back, a faint mark glowed beneath his skin, the same sigil Richard had once seen in the ciphered journals. He turned toward the fields, where a handful of freedmen had gathered at the edge of the property, curious but afraid. Elias lifted his hand, and his voice carried. Calm, commanding, gentle like a promise. This land is open again. Work it, and you will never hunger. Drink from it, and you will never age, but you will serve it, as we have always served. The men hesitated, but one stepped forward. Then another. The ground beneath them shifted, faintly at first, then stronger, like a heart waking. Elias watched, expression serene. The Thornhill line had not ended in fire, it had rooted itself in blood. And in that moment, the plantation lived again, not as history, but as hunger. By the following winter, the land itself seemed to remember. The fields, once barren and blackened, now shimmered with impossible green. Crops that grew faster than they should, roots thick and red, veined, their stalks whispering in the night, as though they shared a secret language. The townspeople said Thornhill was cursed, but Elias called it rebirth. He moved among the workers like a priest in a living cathedral. Each evening he led them in strange rituals, not prayers, but recitations. Words drawn from Catherine's ciphered journals, rewritten into scripture. The men and women would stand barefoot in the soil, chanting in rhythm to the pulse beneath their feet. Non sanguis, said verbum, not blood but word. The phrase repeated until the air itself seemed to hum. At first, the rituals appeared harmless. The harvests were abundant, the workers healthy, the estate restored. But something began to change in their eyes. They no longer spoke freely, no longer left the property. Their sleep was restless, their dreams synchronized. They began to speak in unison, as though one mind threaded through many bodies. Elias watched with pride, noting every twitch, every echo, every sign of what he called the Great Unification. He had discovered the final layer of Catherine's work. Not simply the breeding of bodies, but the merging of consciousness. Every root, every drop of sap, carried her imprint. Her voice had not died with her body, it had been archived in the very land she cultivated. The communion ritual was a way to awaken it. Late one night, Elias stood alone in the chapel ruins, now overtaken by roots that glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. He placed his hand upon the altar, and the vine stirred, curling around his wrist. "Mother," he whispered, "they are ready." A voice replied, faint, feminine, and layered with echoes. "Then speak the binding." He drew a blade and cut his palm, letting the blood drip into the soil. The roots drank greedily, the light intensifying until the walls pulsed with it. The congregation outside felt it too. They dropped to their knees, their bodies trembling as one. Elias smiled through the pain, let the word become flesh again. And across the plantation, the ground breathed. The roots twined into human forms, their eyes opening with the memory of centuries. The communion was complete.